Earth retaliated without mercy. The Galactic Council fell silent. The notification came through on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had just finished my third cup of coffee and was staring at the morning briefing on my console when the alert tone changed. Not the standard chime for incoming diplomatic messages, not the low buzz for council correspondence. This was the override tone, the one that meant something had already happened and no one could stop it. I remember my hands going still on the desk. The feed came in fragments at first. Sensor data from the Europa relay station, heat signatures. Then the relay went dark. Then the backup relay went dark. Then there was nothing from Europa at all, and the silence was worse than any alarm I had ever heard. My name is Owen Garrett. At the time, I was a senior liaison officer for Earth's diplomatic division, based at the Lunar Coordination Hub. My job was to maintain communication between Earth's government and the Galactic Council. I translated protocols. I smoothed over misunderstandings. I spent most of my days making sure humanity kept its seat at a very large, very old table filled with species who had never really wanted us there. I was good at that job. I was patient. I believed in process and in the slow, careful building of trust. I stopped believing in those things at approximately 8:43 in the morning on that Tuesday. The full picture took 11 minutes to assemble. That was how long the strike lasted. 11 minutes from first contact to confirmed silence. The Volkai fleet had entered Europa's orbital space without prior notice, without a formal grievance filing, without the standard council-mandated waiting period that was supposed to give any colony time to respond to complaints. They had simply appeared and done what they came to do. 250,000 people lived on Europa. They worked the helium-3 extraction platforms that supplied fuel to a quarter of the inner solar system. They had families. They had a community orchestra that performed every Friday evening in the Central Dome. The conductor was a woman named Clara Holt, who had emigrated from New Zealand 15 years earlier because she wanted her children to grow up somewhere that felt like the frontier. Her daughter was 9 years old. I knew Clara, not well. We had met twice at council trade summits. She had a way of laughing at bureaucratic nonsense that I had always found refreshing. She was not someone you forgot easily. I sat at my console for a long time after the feed confirmed what had happened. My supervisor, a sharp-minded man named Patrick Crane, came to stand beside me. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. We both understood that what we were looking at was not an accident and not a military miscalculation. The Volkai did not make miscalculations. They were 9,000 years old as a spacefaring civilization. They had ended 17 species' colonial ambitions before humanity had discovered fire. They knew exactly what they were doing. The formal notification from the Galactic Council arrived 4 hours later. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described the action as a corrective enforcement measure in response to Europa colonies' repeated failure to meet helium-3 yield quotas set by the Council's Resource Allocation Committee. The second paragraph noted that the matter was logged and resolved. The third paragraph reminded Earth's government of its obligations under the Provisional Membership Charter and strongly encouraged our leadership to sign the attached non-retaliation accord within 72 hours. Patrick read it over my shoulder. I heard him exhale slowly. "They want us to sign," he said. "Yes," I said. "And if we don't?" I did not answer that. The document was clear enough. If Earth did not sign, the Council would consider our membership status under review. Under review was diplomatic language for something much simpler. It meant they would send the fleet again. The thing about the Galactic Council that most people on Earth never fully understood was that it was not a democracy. It was not even a proper government in any sense that humans would recognize. It was a hierarchy built on the assumption that age equaled authority. The oldest spacefaring civilizations set the rules, Everyone else either accepted those rules or suffered the consequences of refusing. It had worked that way for so long that most of the Council's member species had stopped questioning it. Some of them had been following orders for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to have a choice. Earth had only been in the Council for 11 years. We were the youngest members by a margin that the older species found almost embarrassing. They tolerated our presence the way you might tolerate a very young child who insists on sitting at the adult table. You let them sit. You do not give them a real fork. We had been grateful. We had been careful. We had attended every session, filed every form, met every deadline we could meet. And on a Tuesday morning, they erased 250,000 of us and sent a 3-paragraph notification. I read the non-retaliation accord 3 times. It was 47 pages of legal language that essentially said Earth agreed never to pursue any action against any council member for any enforcement measure taken against human settlements. In exchange, Earth would retain its provisional membership status and be considered for review toward full membership in approximately 200 years. 200 years. I closed the document. Patrick was still standing beside me. He was waiting for me to say something. Around us, the rest of the coordination hub had gone very quiet. People were at their stations, but no one was working. Everyone was waiting. I thought about Clara Holt. I thought about her daughter. I thought about the community orchestra and the central dome and the 9-year-old girl who would never play on the frontier again, because the council had decided that helium-3 quotas were worth more than human lives. I thought about the accord on my screen and what it would mean to sign it. Then I thought about what it would mean not to. I stood up from my console. "I'm not signing it," I said. Patrick looked at me for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he nodded once, very slowly. "Neither am I," he said. I left the hub. I went to my quarters. I sat down on the edge of my bunk and I stared at the wall for a while, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The grief was real. It sat in my chest like a stone and it did not move. But underneath it, something else was forming. Something that had no proper name but felt very much like a decision. I picked up my personal communicator, not the official diplomatic line, the personal one, encrypted with a cipher that predated my council appointment, one that existed in no government registry anywhere. I started making calls. Not to diplomats, not to politicians, not to anyone who sat at tables and filed forms. I called people who built things, people who planned things, people who had spent years working on projects that had no official name and no official funding and no official existence at all. People who, like me, had always suspected this day might come. The Council expected Earth to sign the accord. They expected compliance. In 9,000 years, they had never encountered a species that looked at a non-retaliation accord after losing 250,000 people and said no. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming that we had spent the last 11 years simply attending meetings. We had not. The morning after Europa went dark, I was sitting in a room that officially did not exist, on a level of the lunar hub that appeared on no public schematic, with 7 people who were not supposed to know each other. Their names were simple: Peter Nolan, who ran Deep Space Infrastructure Logistics; Diana Shaw, who headed a defense research division that had no publicly listed budget; Colin Webb, who had spent 14 years embedding himself in council trade networks as a supply chain analyst; Vera King, a materials engineer whose published work on asteroid mining represented perhaps 30% of what she actually did for a living; Hugh Carver, a former military commander who had technically retired 6 years ago and had been anything but idle since; Louise Park, a communications specialist who could thread a signal through a star system without leaving a trace; and myself. We had coffee. We had a wall screen full of data that would have made the Galactic Council significantly less comfortable. And we had a conversation that we had been quietly working toward for years. They did it, Peter said. He did not mean it as a surprise. He meant it as a confirmation. They did it, Diana agreed. Hugh was looking at the wall screen. His expression was calm in the way that very experienced people are calm when they are operating at the edge of something serious. 11 minutes, he said. That's their full operation window against a civilian installation. No defensive emplacements, no warning. 11 minutes. Our window will need to be faster, Collins said. No one disagreed. Here is what most people on Earth did not know. Earth's government had officially maintained a non-aggressive posture since joining the Council. No warship construction beyond registered patrol vessels. No weapons development beyond what was disclosed in the annual Council military transparency reports. No offensive planning of any kind. Officially, the reality was something that had begun quietly, almost instinctively about 8 years earlier. Not because anyone had ordered it. Not because there had been a directive or a declaration or a formal decision made in any room where minutes were taken. It had begun because humans by nature prepare. It is what we do. When we sense a threat, even a distant and theoretical one, something in us starts working on the problem. Quietly, patiently, without making a fuss about it. Diana pulled up the first set of figures. Earth had 41 deep space shipyards operating at what the Council believed was commercial freighter capacity. The actual capacity of those yards had been running at full military specification for the past 4 years, concealed behind false manifests and shell logistics contracts that Collins' network had built and maintained with meticulous care. The vessels coming out of those yards did not look like warships from a distance. They were not supposed to. But at close range, and with the right systems activated, they were something the Council had never calculated for, because the Council had never imagined we would build them. Hugh walked us through the weapons systems. Earth had spent a decade quietly reverse-engineering fragments of alien technology acquired through trade contacts, salvage operations, and one very carefully managed incident near the Karath corridor that had never made it into any report. We had not simply copied what we found. We had taken what we understood and pushed it forward using human engineering instincts, which tend toward the practical, the efficient, and the extremely direct. The kinetic lance arrays, for instance, were our own design. They were based on a principle that the Council's engineers had explored briefly and abandoned centuries ago, because the older civilizations had no particular fondness for brute force solutions. Humans had no such prejudice. A kinetic lance worked by accelerating a dense projectile to a significant fraction of light speed using a magnetic rail system that could be mounted on a vessel the size of a mid-range or freighter. It was not elegant, it was extraordinarily effective. Vera described the material's work. The hull composites we had developed could handle radiation levels and temperature extremes that would disable or destroy the standard shielding used by Volkai vessels. This had not been designed to be superior. It had been designed because our asteroid mining operations took place in environments that the Council species rarely bothered with, and our engineers had needed to solve real problems that no one else had thought to solve. The solutions, it turned out, had other applications. Louise outlined the communications picture. The Council operated its interstellar relay network with the casual confidence of someone who has never had their locks changed. They had built it. They maintained it. The idea that a junior member species barely a century into space travel could find a way into that system would have struck them as almost funny. Louise did not find it funny. She had spent 3 years placing what she called passive listeners at 17 relay nodes, carried by trade vessels whose routing she managed personally. She had spent another 2 years studying the relay firmware. She had spent the final year identifying a specific vulnerability in the synchronization protocol that would allow a targeted logic interruption to propagate through the network and produce a cascading blackout. The interruption code was 11 lines long. She had written it herself, tested it on a closed simulation environment 400 times, and was confident it would work on the first application. "How long for the blackout to spread?" Hugh asked. "Full network coverage in about 9 minutes, Louise said. "They'll have emergency backup channels, but those run at about 12% of normal capacity and require manual switching at each node. That takes time." "How much time?" "Enough," she said. Colin walked us through the intelligence picture. He had spent years building relationships inside the Council's trade bureaucracy. Not friendships exactly, more like an understanding. He knew which species were genuinely committed to Volkai dominance and which ones tolerated it out of habit and calculated self-interest. He knew where the fault lines were. He knew which council members had grievances of their own that they had never been permitted to express. That information was not tactical in the conventional sense, but it would matter later. Peter was the last to present. His section was short. "Logistics are ready," he said. "Fuel, supply chains, crew rotation, extraction protocols. We can sustain operations across 7-star systems simultaneously for a minimum of 4 months without any external resupply. If we need longer, there are contingencies." He paused. "We have been ready for 2 years," he said. "We were waiting to see if we would ever need to use it." The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at each of them in turn. Peter, who had given the best years of his career to building something he had hoped would never be necessary. Diana, who had run on almost no sleep for longer than any of us could reasonably track. Colin, who had lived a double life so carefully constructed that even his family did not fully understand what he did. Vera, Louise, Hugh. People who had not been ordered to prepare. People who had simply seen what was coming and started working, the way humans always do. "The Council spy report came through this morning," Colin said. "They found fragments of the shipyard data, passed it up the chain." "And?" Diana asked. He almost smiled. The Council's response was that it wasn't worth investigating further. They said, and I am quoting from the Intercept, that humans have had spaceflight for 2 centuries and the Volkai have had it for 9,000. There was nothing to be concerned about. No one laughed. It was not funny enough for laughter. "They measure power in years," Hugh said quietly. "Yes," I said. He looked at the wall screen for a moment. "They've been out here so long they've forgotten what it looks like when a species runs out of time and stops being patient." That was the heart of it. That was what the Council had never understood about us and would not understand until it was far too late to adjust. We are not a patient species by nature. We are a species that has learned to be patient when patience serves us, and abandons it completely when it does not. The older civilizations had coasted on their head start for so long that they had confused age with invincibility. They had forgotten that there is a particular kind of determination that only comes from having something to lose. We had lost 250,000 people on a Tuesday morning. We were no longer patient. Over the following weeks, the planning sessions became something close to constant. Hugh ran tactical drills with vessel commanders who communicated only through Louise's encrypted channels. Diana's teams ran final systems checks on weapons arrays that had never been fired in a real engagement. Colin mapped and refined the list of targets, removing anything that would cause harm to non-combatants, insisting on that line with a firmness that I respected and shared. Vera's materials division ran last-minute stress tests on hull composites under simulated combat conditions. I handled the diplomatic picture. I attended council sessions. I filed routine correspondence. I maintained the appearance of a junior member species that was, as expected, quietly processing its grief and preparing to sign the accord. I was very good at it. Years of practice. Every day I sat in those sessions and listened to the council's senior members discuss resource allocation and border protocols and long-term galactic development plans. And every day I was aware that beneath the surface of all that careful normalcy, Something enormous was being assembled in the dark. The Council had sent a follow-up message about the Accord, a polite reminder, then a firmer reminder. I had responded to both with language that was technically a non-answer, but sounded, if you were reading it quickly, very much like progress toward agreement. They were not reading carefully. They never did when it came to us. There was one evening, near the end of the planning period, when I was sitting alone in my quarters going over the final target list. Every name on that list was a military installation, a weapons platform, a strategic command node, nothing else. I had gone over it 4 times and would go over it several more. The line that Colin had insisted on and I had agreed to without hesitation was non-negotiable. We were not going to be what had hurt us. Whatever happened, that mattered. I thought again about Clara Holt, about 250,000 names, about a 9-year-old girl. I thought about the 3-paragraph notification. Logged and resolved. Outside my window, the stars were perfectly still. Somewhere out there, a council that had never been challenged in 9,000 years was going about its business with the comfortable certainty of the untested. I closed the target list. I thought about something Hugh had said in that first meeting. They have been out here so long, they have forgotten what it looks like when a species runs out of patience. I set my communicator down on the desk. Not for much longer, I said to no one. It began at 400 hours, station time on a Thursday. There was no declaration, no announcement, no warning transmitted on any frequency the Council monitored. I was aboard the command vessel, a ship called the Steadfast, which had spent the last 2 years registered in the Council's shipping database as a long-range ore processor assigned to the outer belt. It looked like one, from most angles. It did not perform like one. Hugh was in the commander's seat. I was beside him as the senior civilian authority on the operation, which meant that any decision involving target modification or engagement rules came to me. I was not there to observe. I was there to be accountable, which felt important. Louise's code had gone into the Council relay network 6 hours earlier, carried by a trade vessel that had passed through the Kareth relay node on a routine supply run. The vessel's crew had known nothing about what they were carrying. The code had been embedded in a standard firmware update packet that the relay node accepted automatically, as it had accepted thousands of similar packets over the years. It sat dormant for exactly 6 hours and then activated. At 3:57, the Council's communication network began to degrade, not catastrophically, not in a way that would immediately trigger an emergency response, just a slight increase in relay latency, a few dropped handshakes, the kind of minor technical noise that a network of that size generated regularly and that the automated monitoring systems were calibrated to ignore below a certain threshold. Louise had calibrated her code to stay just below that threshold for 18 minutes. At 4:15, it crossed the threshold and the cascade began. We watched it on the network map that Louise had built. Node by node, the relay lights shifted from green to amber to red. The full network did not go dark all at once. It went dark the way a city loses power in a rolling blackout area by area, the lights going out in sequence like something breathing its last. 9 minutes and 40 seconds from cascade initiation to full network blackout. They'll have emergency channels up in about 40 minutes, Louise said from her station, her voice completely even. That's enough, Hugh said. It was. At 400, across 7 star systems, Earth's forces moved simultaneously, not in a wave, not in sequence, all at once at a moment coordinated down to the second across the distances involved, using a timing system that Peter's logistics division had spent 2 years calibrating. The Volkai shipyard at Kareth Station was the primary target. It was the largest military construction facility in the Council's enforcement network, capable of producing 3 heavy cruisers per year, and currently housing the same fleet class that had been deployed to Europa. The kinetic lance arrays on the 4 vessels assigned to that engagement opened fire from long range. We had chosen long range deliberately for 2 reasons. First, it reduced our exposure. Second, and more importantly, the Volkai fleet doctrine was built around close engagement defense systems that were extremely effective at short range. They had never needed to develop long-range countermeasures. No one had ever shot at them from that distance before. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Karath Station's shipyard was no longer operational. I watched the confirmation come through on the screen in front of me and felt something complex and heavy move through me that I did not have a clean name for. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was the feeling of crossing a line that you have thought about for a long time and still find when you cross it, that it weighs more than you expected. Across the other 6 systems, the reports came in within the next 8 minutes. Council weapons platforms, supply depots, communication relay hardpoints, command nodes, every target on the list that Colin had spent months refining, every one scrubbed clean of anything that housed non-combatant populations. There was one moment that I want to be precise about, because it mattered. At 4:12, the Steadfast received an updated sensor sweep of our secondary target in the current system. The sweep showed a structure adjacent to the command node that had not appeared in our pre-operation intelligence. Closer analysis identified it as a processing hub for civilian trade logistics, non-military personnel, potentially several thousand of them. The secondary target was within the engagement arc. The calculation to include it would have been simple. I did not make that calculation. "Reroute," I said to Hugh. He looked at me. He already knew what I was going to say. He had known since the first planning session when we had established that line together. "Rerouting," he said and gave the order. We lost the secondary target. We added 4 minutes to our exposure window while the vessels repositioned. It was operationally suboptimal. It was also exactly who we had agreed to be. The Volkai response came faster than their historical patterns suggested it would. I think the absence of their communication network produced a kind of confusion that accelerated rather than slowed their decision-making. Automated defense platforms activated. A fast-response patrol group moved to intercept one of our vessels near the outer edge of the Karath engagement zone. Hugh's commanders handled it. I will not pretend it was clean or simple. It was not. 3 Earth vessels took significant damage. Crew members were injured. The cost was real, and I will not gloss over it. But the patrol group did not succeed in its mission. The Earth forces disengaged on the planned timeline, pulling back to positions that the Volkai fleet, with its damaged coordination systems, could not pursue effectively. By 500, all Earth forces were withdrawing on schedule. By 5:30, the Council's emergency communication channels were active. By 5:45, I had received the first of what would become a very long series of urgent messages demanding that Earth explain itself. I read the first one and set it aside. I was not ready to explain anything yet. I was sitting in the command chair on the Steadfast, reading the final engagement reports, and I was thinking about what came next, not the fighting. The fighting was, by design, already over. What came next was the harder part, the part that would determine what any of this had actually been for. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when something unprecedented has happened, and the people who consider themselves in charge do not yet know what to do about it. I had experienced smaller versions of it in diplomatic settings. A negotiation that shifted unexpectedly. A proposal that caught a delegation off guard. This was not a small version. Across the Council's communication channels, in the fragments coming through the emergency network, I could hear an entire civilization of ancient and comfortable certainty encountering something it had no template for. 9,000 years of uncontested authority, and the species that had been on the other end of a 3-paragraph notification 4 weeks ago had just demonstrated that the notification had been a mistake. Hugh came and stood beside me. "That's going to make some noise," he said, looking at the reports. "Yes," I said. "Ready for what comes next?" I looked at the screen, at the engagement reports, at the cost columns that I would read in full and carry with me for the rest of my life, at the target list where every civilian location remained untouched. "Ready enough," I said. The summons from the Galactic Council came within 48 hours. It was not phrased as a summons. It never was with the Council. It was phrased as an urgent invitation for urgent dialogue regarding recent events of significant concern. The language was formal and very old, the kind of language that had been used to call junior members before the senior table for centuries. The kind of language that assumed you would come because you had no real option but to come. I accepted. I went alone. That was my choice, and I made it deliberately. The council chamber held representatives of over 200 species. I wanted to walk in as one person speaking for one planet, because that was the truth of it, and I did not want to obscure the truth behind a large delegation. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was the most impressive room I had ever been in and the most uncomfortable. It was built to make you feel small. The ceiling was several hundred meters above the floor. The seating arrangements placed Earth's section at the outer edge of the lower gallery, far from the central dais where the senior members presided. The room had been designed to communicate, without a single word being spoken, exactly where you stood in the order of things. I walked to the Earth section and I sat down. My heart was steady. I had spent a long time preparing for this specific room on this specific day. The session opened with the standard ceremonial language. Then the presiding voice, belonging to a senior Volkai representative named Counselor Doth, asked Earth's delegation to account for the events of the past 48 hours. Counselor Doth was approximately 3 meters tall, gray-scaled, and had the particular stillness of something that had been in authority for a very long time and had never been made to feel otherwise. His species communicated through a combination of subvocal frequency and translated speech, and his translated voice carried an undertone that suggested, without saying so directly, that he found this entire session beneath his usual concerns. I had expected that. I stood up. "Thank you for the invitation," I said. My own voice through the translation system came out clear and level. I had practiced the specific register for weeks, not aggressive, not apologetic, simply present. I continued without waiting for a response. 41 days ago, the Volkai fleet conducted a strike against Europa colony. 250,000 residents of that colony were killed in 11 minutes. No formal grievance had been filed through the processes set out in the Provisional Membership Charter. No warning was issued. No opportunity for resolution was provided. The Galactic Council issued a notification describing this as a corrective enforcement measure and presented Earth with a non-retaliation accord. I paused for exactly 2 seconds. Earth did not sign the accord. The room was already very quiet. It became quieter. What followed was Earth's formal response to an act of aggression against its people. All targets selected in that response were military or strategic installations. No action was taken against any civilian population or non-combatant facility. That was not an oversight. It was a decision. Counselor Doth began to speak. I let him finish, which took about 90 seconds and contained a significant amount of language about violations of the membership charter and the authority of the Council, and the consequences that Earth could expect to face. When he was done, I reached into my carry case and placed a data slate on the table in front of me. "This document contains Earth's current military capacity as of this morning," I said. "Vessel count, weapons specifications, crew numbers, operational range, and strategic reach. I would invite the council to review it before determining what consequences it intends to pursue. I slid the data slate forward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a member of the council's administrative staff walked down from the central dais and carried the slate up to be reviewed. I watched Councillor Doth read it. I watched his expression remain controlled. I watched his eyes move through the figures twice. I watched his deputy lean over and read the same figures. I said nothing. I waited. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with any single visible sign. It was more like a change in pressure, the kind of shift you feel before weather turns. Several of the delegations in the mid-gallery began quiet conversations with each other. A representative from the Sarath Collective, a species that had been a junior member for nearly 400 years and had never been consulted on anything of significance, was watching me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to see something change. Councillor Doth set down the data slate. "Earth does not have the standing to make demands of this council," he said. "No," I agreed, "not under the current charter, which is why I am not making demands under the current charter." I let that sit for a moment. "I am telling you what Earth requires in order to return to full cooperation with this body. Those requirements are three. First, that the Galactic Council formally recognize the strike on Europa Colony as what it was, not a corrective measure, not a logged and resolved administrative action, what it was." I said the specific word. I said it clearly and without hesitation in standard Galactic translation, and I watched it land in the room. Second, that the individuals within the Volcae command structure responsible for that strike be brought before a multi-species tribunal, to be constituted with equal representation from member species at all tiers of membership, not only senior members. Several delegations had gone completely still. Third, that Earth's membership in this body be reclassified from provisional to full, with immediate effect, including equal voting rights on the Resource Allocation Committee and the Security Mandate Board. The room did not explode into noise. That is what I had expected, and it did not happen. Instead, there was a long, complex silence that contained, if you listened carefully, the sound of very old certainty starting to crack. Councillor Doth was looking at me. His translated voice, when it came, was measured and very cool. "And if these requirements are not met?" I looked back at him. "Then Earth will continue to act in the interest of its people," I said. "I believe the Council has now seen sufficient evidence of what that means in practice." I sat back down. The silence continued. Then, from the mid-gallery, the Sarath Collective representative stood and formally requested the floor. The request was procedurally unusual. Junior members did not typically request the floor during senior review sessions. Doth's deputy started to object, and then did not, because 3 other delegations had simultaneously made the same request, and denying all of them would have required a ruling that a significant portion of the chamber appeared disinclined to support. Over the next 6 hours, I watched the council's internal architecture begin to reorganize itself around a new reality. Not smoothly, not without resistance. The Volcae bloc held firm through the afternoon session. 2 of their closest allied species backed them publicly, but 4 others did not. The Sarath Collective and 2 smaller species from the outer membership tier formally aligned with Earth's position by the end of the day. A 5th species made contact through a private channel during the evening recess, through Collins' network, to indicate that they would align as well. The Council did not make any formal decisions on the first day. That was expected. Institutions of that age do not move quickly. But by the time the day session closed and I walked out of the grand chamber into the connecting corridor, something had changed. A junior aide from a species I did not immediately recognize stopped me just outside the chamber doors. She was young, at least by the standards of her kind, and she looked at me with the direct, serious expression of someone who had something to say and was not sure she was allowed to say it. "My government would like you to know," she said carefully, "that there are more of us who are watching than you might think." I thanked her, she nodded and walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment, alone. Somewhere above me, through the layers of the station and then through the vacuum, was Earth. Was the lunar hub where I had sat at my console on a Tuesday morning and read a 3-paragraph notification. Was a rebuilt memorial on a moon where 250,000 names were now carved into stone. I thought about what Patrick had said, standing beside me in that moment. I thought about Clara Holt and her daughter, who had survived because she had been off colony at a school visit on the morning the fleet arrived. I thought about what it meant that she had survived, and what it meant that her mother had not, and the particular weight of carrying both of those facts at the same time. I straightened my jacket. I turned back toward the temporary Earth diplomatic office that had been set up in the station's secondary corridor. There was more work to do. There would be more work to do for a long time. I was not afraid of work. 5 years after Europa, I sat in a chair that had been built for a species with a very different skeletal structure, at a table that had been designed without human proportions in mind, in a room that was still, in 100 small ways, not built for us. I sat there anyway. I had gotten good at that. My name was on the nameplate in front of me as Earth's co-chair of the restructured Galactic Covenant, not a provisional member, not a junior delegate, co-chair, a role that had been created as part of the settlement framework and that the old council's senior members had agreed to with varying degrees of grace, none of it entirely genuine, all of it binding. The tribunal was ongoing. It moved at the speed that justice tends to move at when the institutions responsible for it are also the institutions that failed in the first place. Slowly, with a great deal of procedural argument and documentation and testimony, the senior Volkai commanders responsible for the Europa strike had been formally charged. The proceedings were open and multi-species in their composition, which had been a condition I refused to compromise on. It was not a perfect process. Nothing about it was perfect, but it was a process, and it was real, and 250,000 names were in the court record. Peter was running the logistics division of the new Covenant Secretariat. He had aged 5 years in what looked like 10, which was also true of most of the people who had been in that room on the lunar hub. Diana had returned to research, which suited her better than administration. Colin was technically retired but was still, as far as I could tell, maintaining approximately half of his old network out of what he described as professional habit. Louise had built the Covenant's new communication infrastructure from the ground up, and it was significantly harder to compromise than the old one, because she had designed it herself. Hugh had come to see me 3 weeks after the main engagement. He had sat across from me in my office and we had talked for 2 hours, not about strategy or logistics but about the people we had lost in the operation. 3 crew members on one of the damaged vessels, 2 on another. There had been others injured. He spoke about each of them by name, which I expected, because Hugh was that kind of man. I listened to all of it. I did not try to balance it against anything or contextualize it or point to the larger purpose. I just listened. We both understood that those names belonged on the same list as every other name that had been carved into stone on Europa. Cost is cost. It does not sort itself into categories of acceptable and unacceptable based on the side of the conflict it falls on. The new covenant operated differently from the old council in a number of structural ways, most of which had been negotiated in exhausting detail over the better part of 2 years. Equal representation on the core committees regardless of how long a species had been spacefaring. A formal grievance process with actual teeth, meaning a timeline, a neutral arbiter, and consequences for non-compliance that applied to senior members as well as junior ones. A prohibition on unilateral enforcement actions against member populations, full stop, with no carve-out for corrective measures. The Volcae had not signed the new charter with enthusiasm. Several of their allied species had been openly hostile to the process, but they had signed because the alternative was something none of them wanted to test again. That was not the relationship I would have chosen if I had been designing the situation from the beginning. Trust built on calculated self-interest is a fragile thing. I knew that. I was working on the other kind, the slower kind, and I expected it to take longer than I would live to see completed. That was acceptable. Some things take more than one generation. Humans understand that better than most species gave us credit for. Vera had come to see me a few weeks before this particular session. She was working on a joint materials research project with 2 other species, a collaboration that had no strategic component and no military application, just genuinely shared scientific curiosity about the properties of certain deep space mineral formations. She had walked into my office looking like someone who had remembered something good. "You know what the strangest part is," she said. "Tell me," I said. "They like working with us, the researchers on the other teams. They find us interesting, the way we approach problems." She paused. "I think some of them have wanted to do this for a while and just never had the context for it." I thought about that for a long time after she left. It was, in its small way, a piece of what I had hoped for. Not the piece that made the news dispatches or the Covenant records. Just a quiet room somewhere with people who were different from each other finding common ground around a shared question. The kind of thing that does not change the galaxy all at once but accumulates, slowly, into something that does. On the day of the session I am describing, I arrived early and sat alone in the chamber for a few minutes before the other delegates filed in. The room was large and still, and the light came in at an angle that made it look almost warm. I had a folder in front of me with the day's agenda, which included a discussion of the revised resource allocation framework, a report from the Tribunal's second chamber, and a proposal from the Sarath Collective regarding expanded scientific cooperation zones. The aide who had stopped me in the corridor 5 years ago was now a full delegate for her species. She had been elected to the Covenant's Joint Science Committee and had sent me a formal note when the appointment was confirmed. In it she had said simply that she was glad the conversation had continued. I had kept the note. I thought about the memorial on Europa. It had been built over 2 years on the surface of the reconstructed settlement. The rebuilding had been funded partly by Earth and partly by a voluntary contribution from 11 Covenant member species, which had surprised me and continued to surprise me when I thought about it. The memorial was not large or elaborate. It was a plain curved wall of pale stone, and on it were carved 250,000 names in order of the residential records as they had existed on the day of the strike. Every name. No abbreviations. Below the names, in every language spoken by Covenant members, was a single line that I had written myself, and that had been approved after some discussion by the Covenant's Memorial Committee. It said, "We remember, we returned, we did not become what hurt us." I had fought for that last sentence. A few members of the committee had suggested it was confrontational. I had said that it was clarifying. There is a difference between aggression and an honest statement about character, and that line was a statement about character, about who we had chosen to be when we had, for a brief window, the option to choose otherwise. We had hit military targets. We had rerouted away from civilians at operational cost. We had come to the council chamber alone and spoken plainly and made conditions that were firm but specific. We had not tried to dismantle the council entirely, not because we lacked the capacity, but because dismantling a structure that held 200 species together would have created a vacuum that hurt everyone, including the people we were trying to protect. Restraint is not weakness. I had said that in the chamber once, during a particularly contentious session, and the room had gone quiet in the way it goes quiet when something lands correctly. The Volcae representative still regarded me with hostility. I expected that would continue for some time. Their culture had a concept that translated roughly as earned adversary, meaning a party that had demonstrated sufficient capability and consistency to warrant genuine respect rather than simply managed tolerance. I had been told, through a back channel that Colin maintained with a Volkai cultural analyst, that some within their government had placed Earth in that category. I did not know how to feel about that. It was not what I had wanted, but I had stopped expecting things to be simple. Delegates were filing into the chamber now. The representative from the Sarath Collective caught my eye across the room and gave a slight nod, the particular nod that in their culture indicates readiness to begin. I returned it. Patrick had sent me a message that morning. He was back on Earth, running the diplomatic training program for the next generation of council representatives. He sent me messages periodically, usually short, usually precise. This one said only, "The students asked about Europa today. I told them the truth, all of it." I had replied, "Good." Because that was what all of this had to be built on, eventually. Not fear, not calculated deterrence, not the weight of what Earth had demonstrated it could do when pushed past a certain point. Those things had their role. They had been necessary. They were still necessary in the practical sense of a galaxy that was still learning what equality actually meant in practice. But underneath all of it, the thing that had to last, the thing that had to grow in the spaces between sessions and formal agreements and ongoing tribunal proceedings, was something simpler. The truth, spoken plainly, carried forward by people who understood what it had cost and refused to let the cost be forgotten or softened or edited into something more comfortable. 250,000 names on a wall on Europa. A 9-year-old girl who was now 14 and lived with relatives in Scotland and wanted, according to the last information I had, to study music. Clara Holt, who had conducted an orchestra in a dome on a moon and had laughed at bureaucratic nonsense and had deserved every year she did not get. The session was called to order. I opened my folder. I picked up my pen. I turned my attention to the business of building, slowly and imperfectly, and with full awareness of how far there was still to go, something better than what had been there before. The galaxy was watching. We were not afraid of being watched. We had nothing to hide.